I'm really excited today to welcome Professor Daniel Mügge and Professor Regina Paul, who will present their book as part of the Hague Program Book Seminar Series today. And I'm really pleased to introduce them. So Professor Daniel Mügge is a professor of political arithmetic in the Political Science Department of the University of Amsterdam. And Professor Regina Paul is based at the University of Bergen and also at the Max Planck Institute of Social Sciences. And they're here today to present their book, The AI Matrix, Profits, Power, and Politics, which is available open access and was recently published with Agenda Publishing. And just in line with the format of the book seminars, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we'll first start with a lovely book talk by the speakers, and then we will open up to Q&A. So just have your questions ready and raise your hand when we move into the Q&A section. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand it over to professors. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting us, Julia. We'll basically split it up between two of the three co-authors. It's going to be Regina and myself. And given that obviously we have limited time, we'll try to touch upon a few of the main messages. As Julia already mentioned, the book itself is available open access. If you just Google the title, you'll find it. So any more details that we won't be able to cover either in the presentation or in the Q&A, you can just find them all in the book. What I'll also do is, because Regina has the slides on her computer, so I'll sort of like cue her from afar to switch to the next slide. And Regina, I think we could start with the first one right now. So one of the questions, of course, that immediately pops up is, do we need more books on AI? If you go into a bookshop these days, certainly among the better ones, they'll have a whole shelf full of them. And Regina, Vali, and I also ask ourselves whether it was really necessary and why it would be necessary for us to pen an additional one. But to be fair, when Regina and I initially, with the two of us, started this whole project, there was a very specific aspect of the conversations about AI that really bugged us somehow. And what it was that both the positive as well as the more negative or critical accounts of AI and how it was changing our world had something that, as we put it here in this particular slide, had a slightly imperial feel to them. And what we mean by that is that there was an account of AI that somehow was like a meteor that was hitting the world from the outside, that would somehow cover everything and would cover also our economies with a layer of AI that would somehow transform everything and shift it either to a higher plane in the positive accounts, or would somehow like destroy everything. But it was a pretty total account, as if there comes AI, it's one thing, it changes everything for better or for worse, and then we move on. And as people, as social scientists, we felt that that was not only a very unnuanced account of what was going on, but that it was also massively ignoring the politics of this all. Next slide, please. And so Regina and I, and Vali as well, being rooted in the tradition of global political economy, felt that there were at least four specific aspects of how this AI transformation takes place that really deserved highlighting here. And the visual that you can see here is basically what inspired us to call this book The AI Matrix in the end, because it is as if this AI transformation, so the development and deployment of these technologies, is basically boxed in by these contextual factors that we felt had received way too little attention. At the top left, you see political agency and institutions, which for us was important to highlight that choices about which kind of AI is developed, how it is diffused, but also how it is governed, have been political from the get-go. There is a common narrative that would somehow suggest that AI originates in the minds and on the desks of innovators somehow, comes to the world, and then in a second or a third stage, somehow political entities would react to that. And one of the things that we discuss in the book, how from the very beginning, AI had been imbued also with political goals, how governments have sponsored AI research, how organizations either from government or close to government have infused the whole project of building AI with particular political rationales, military goals, for example, but also a dream of having machines that could control society and economic flows and these sorts of things better. So AI has been political from the get-go. And certainly when we look to how it is governed these days, political institutions that differ around the world, but also global ones, of course, have a huge impact there. The second aspect on the top right-hand side was the performativity of tech narratives. In a phenomenon that I think you can basically witness all over different kinds of emerging technologies, the decisions that are being taken here and now, both on the public and on the private side, so by governments, policymakers, standard setters, but also by investors and people who develop these technologies, are fundamentally driven by ideas and narratives about the future. Whether or not it is a good idea to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in these specific technologies all depends on the ideas that we have about what they will bring in the future. And whether policymakers think that it's absolutely inevitable that, say, for example, Europe follows the path of other major tech powers to develop and deploy and roll out these technologies, again, completely hangs on the stories that people believe in about why it will or will not be important or a good or a bad thing to have these technologies everywhere in our societies. We felt that that particular aspect, this performativity of tech narratives, so how the stories that are told about AI and the stories that are believed about AI, how they themselves shape the politics of what gets developed and rolled out, that was massively underappreciated in the way that we discuss these things. Then at the bottom left, you see the imperative of geo-economic races. Again, the main narrative seemed to suggest that there was a technological innovation, so a new tool that appeared in society's toolboxes, and that then somehow would get deployed to the degree that people think they can benefit from its deployment. And something that gets a lot of attention in our book is that this basically technology and company-centered narrative is embedded in a wider context in which these geo-economic, geopolitical forces play a massive role. And most of all, of course, the competition in this field between the United States on the one hand and China on the other hand. That is the meta context in which companies, but also governments in both of these countries push the technology forward against some serious doubts as to whether it should be going this fast. And it's also the context in which the European Union feels that it is basically losing out in a putative tech race, and so also puts all its chips onto this technology, tries to build up investment programs and to push this whole technology forward. Finally, on the bottom right hand, again, something that we felt was woefully missing from many accounts of how AI was changing the world was the spatial unevenness and global connectedness. And when we talk about spatial unevenness and global connectedness, I think there are two aspects here that come together. The first one is that the dominant AI story is one that is very much told about the global north and the countries in which most of this innovation is happening. But basically, the rest of the world, which is actually the vast majority of the human population, is somehow left out of this story. Where are the other 6.5 billion people that are not in Europe and the United States or other countries that are at the forefront of developing these technologies? They're hardly ever talked about, and we show how their position in this global AI universe is also quite crucial. Regine will say more about that later. And the spatial unevenness is important because somehow there is this general suggestion, a lot of the popular literature, that AI is somehow smeared out over societies or economies, sort of like a layer of icing across a cake, that it somehow covers everything. Whereas what we see, in fact, we felt was that there are certain pockets of the economy and of societies where AI becomes very transformative and very important, but there are also other spots where that's not at all the case. Next slide, please. So what that means for us when it comes to the messages that we take of the stories that we tell, it's first of all that these tech transformations, they're neither technically nor economically determined, right? Political action institutions make and shape them. And the picture that you see here on the left is probably one that many of you have seen already. This was during the inauguration of Donald Trump in January 2025, where many of the leading bosses of major US tech firms were assembled as part of basically a process in which the the bosses of Silicon Valley and the Trump administration had reluctantly at times, but still sort of like grown together to become enmeshed. At the same time, the picture on the right, taken from the MIT Tech Review, is meant to illustrate that we see in different corners also different kinds of resistance against the diffusion of technologies. One example here would be how, say, in the United States, for example, there is a lot of local resistance to the massive build out of data centers because of the environmental damage that they cause, but also because of the energy resources, for example, that they consume. Next slide, please. As we said earlier, there is a lot of speculative tech narratives and ideologies out there. And what's important for us in this book is to not only disassemble them a little bit further, but also to dig more deeply into their provenance. So, for example, on the right-hand side, you see the state of AI, how organizations are rewiring to capture value. This is taken from McKinsey's State of AI report from 2025. You'll find many of these kinds of reports on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And these kinds of reports are, of course, crucial in firing up the imagination, again, not only of people who work in the private sector elsewhere, but also of governments when it comes to what the chance is that they can either seize or miss right here. So what we find is that there are very specific sources of these kinds of narratives, often from within the tech sector itself, but also, say, for example, from consultancies who might earn money with not only pushing these narratives, but then selling their own advisory services on the back of that. The fact that these kinds of narratives are pushed by certain people doesn't necessarily mean that all of them are wrong. Just because they're self-interest, it doesn't mean that there's no truth to that, but it means that there is an additional loop built in to the tech development that we believe deserves unpacking from a social science perspective. Next slide, please. When we look at Europe specifically, it's something that I mentioned briefly already. I guess the key moment was the publication of the Draghi report here in 2024. Basically a document that, with its emphasis on competitiveness, has ever since its publication captured the minds of many public policy officials within Brussels and elsewhere, because that basically cemented that idea, the name says it already, that Europe finds itself in a situation of competition, and mostly of competition with China and the United States. But not only here has this whole idea of that tech race taken serious root. On the left-hand side, you see a screenshot of an executive order from July 2025 promoting the export of the American AI technology stack, in which Donald Trump has basically elevated the pushing of American AI tech onto other nations into a central goal of US administration policy. So this is something where the geoeconomic logics, but also the public policy rationales become extremely evident. Next slide, please. Finally, when it comes to these global projects, the map that you see on the left-hand side with the putative global AI leaders, I think just illustrates the point that I made earlier, to what degree there are very specific regions within the world that are considered to be high tech or leaders in this AI race, but also how much of the world basically falls out of this imaginary as somehow being disconnected, where what we see, in fact, is that there are clear hierarchies emerging between tech leaders in this particular field, but more from a political economy perspective, are there also chains of extraction that build up between these different levels, and how basically sort of like there is this wider light blue world that's somewhat implicated in the tech progress that we see in these countries. On the right-hand side, you see a visualization of the digital Silk Road, so the Chinese project to try to boost its, if you will, digital empire around the world. And that, again, is sort of like one specific visualization of, as it were, sort of like the technological, but also financial tentacles that often follow different kinds of digital arteries, submarine cables, and the like, to build one of the digital empires that is de facto focused on China. Next slide, please. Here you see a brief overview of the different stops that we take in the book. So this is our table of contents right here. And I guess particularly important, Regine will say a bit more about that later, are here the chapters 4, 5, and 7, which emphasize the unevenness of many of these transformations. So as I said earlier, that AI is somehow not like an icing on the cake that covers the whole global economy basically as one big layer, but there's unevenness between sectors, between countries, and the effects on labor, but also basically from a global perspective around the world. Next slide, please. One of the things that has been bugging us from the get-go when it came to writing this book is that there is a lot of variation, technological variation under this umbrella of AI to begin with. And I just want to mention 3 different things here where we feel it's really important to differentiate between these different technologies because they have very different political economy effects. So if we compare generative AI models, ChatGPT and the like on the one hand, and then smart robotics applications, so like Spot the robot dog right here, but also say robotics applications in a factory or something, and also something like computer vision that may be used for biometric identification systems, then the political economy dynamics of these different kinds of AI varies enormously. Think, for example, of the money that is necessary to build these kinds of technologies. Generative AI, large language models, need a lot more upfront investment, but also, for example, the degree to which there are network effects, economies of scale, because the diffusion and access to a large language model is, of course, much easier to organize through a computer browser. That's all you need. Than, for example, the sale of hardware like robotics, for example. So in the book, we spend a lot of time talking about these different kinds of AI because they have very, very different political economy dynamics. Next slide, please. So finally, when we take a few looks here at the different, more specific economic dynamics, then I think something that's important for us is just how concentrated a lot of this scene is. What we see here on the left-hand side is the capital expenditures, both realized but also expected, on basically data centers, both those for inference and for training a lot of AI systems. And what we see is basically 2 things. On the one hand, the enormous sums that are involved and continue to rise, so hundreds of billions of dollars per year, but also how enormously concentrated it is with what you could call sort of like legacy tech firms. So companies like Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, and Alphabet, so who are not AI-only firms, but how big tech has basically, with its spending power, assumed dominant positions and actually also in terms of hardware dominating this field. And on the right-hand side, we see a comparable kind of concentration where in the US market in particular, Anthropic and OpenAI basically dominate a scene in which there are a few other players, but it's really a highly concentrated market right here in a way that is very reminiscent of other subdomains of the digital economy. Next slide, please. That's also true then for the concentration of profits and value, where we see here different countries shaded in different depth of blue, basically to reflect how much concentration and profit value happens there. This is basically sort of like the flip side of the global AI leaders slide that we showed you earlier. And again, we see that the United States and Canada, Western Europe and China lead here. There are a few other countries where at least some of these profits accrue, but large swaths of the global landscape are completely white here, speaking to the unevenness of the AIification, if you will, of the digital economy. Next slide, please. That's also true then when we look at the hardware. For a very long time, a lot of the conversation about AI was about the companies that built these algorithms and trained them. So companies like Anthropic, OpenAI, Mistral, for example, here in Europe, or DeepSeek in China. Whereas in fact, a lot of the money is actually made by companies that design or also manufacture and make these kinds of chips. Also there we see a similar kind of concentration. NVIDIA, obviously, here the blue stack as part of these columns that you see, but also companies like Google, AMD, Huawei, and Amazon, which dominate this kind of a sector. So again, note both the concentration and the exponential growth that we see here. Next slide, please. The final thing for me to mention before I hand over to Regine is how these different facets of the economic, highly concentrated AI boom are interconnected. What you see here is financial flows that connect very large companies like Microsoft and Nvidia right here, to others that in that sense, economically, financial flows wise, are slightly more at the periphery of this financial network. What happens here is a lot of back and forth where Nvidia, as the company that earns most of the money through the design and then later on sale of these chips, basically either invests or lends money to other companies that those need in order to buy the chips from Nvidia itself. What that means is, rather than having a traditional kind of market where we have independent agents that somehow do their own thing, what we get is an interwoven network of companies where the economic risks from a potential bursting of an AI bubble become really difficult to trace and to understand who actually holds the hot potato if something goes wrong. In any case, what we see here is sort of like a tightly knit cluster of corporate behemoths in the digital sphere in the United States that, if nothing else, also constitutes an enormous concentration of power. And with that, Regina, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I have to apologize. I've fled my office because there was drilling going on. And then 10 minutes ago, the neighbor started drilling in my home office. So I hope that you don't hear too much of it. And I'll continue after Daniel has shared with us some of these more general dynamics of concentration of political economic power in this AI game, to go back to our argument about unevenness and walk you through some of the unevenness that we trace in the book across sectors for different types of jobs, but also across the globe. And I'll start with the uneven adoption of AI in different economic sectors. So what Daniel described so far in terms of economic concentration is what we would call the AI first type of market, right? Where bits of the stack are being produced, as it were, whether it's chips, computing power, cloud software, but also models themselves. We're now concerned in this part of the talk and in this part of the book with how economic sectors and firms down the line adopt AI to do things with it, right? And we distinguish in the book between two main uses of AI. One is to generate new value, so to do something to your production line as a manufacturer, as a healthcare provider, that genuinely generates new income by making new products, for example, right? But the other one is to capture value from parts of the value chain that you're already within, right? From competitors, for example. And that's very important to bear in mind for some of the dynamics that you see on this slide, for example, as well. Well, let's start with the AI adoption rate for different firm sizes, and the data we show here are mainly on the US. So what you can see in this slide is two interesting observations. One is that both smaller, so very small firms who only have up to 4 employees, and very large firms with more than 250 employees tended to lead the adoption of AI in the US. So they're kind of up there around the 6, 7, up to 12, 13% of AI adoption. But you can also see that for the large firms, this use is trending down over the last couple of months. So that's just interesting to observe. There's something here about the potential fluctuation of how useful different firms of different sizes seem to be finding AI. And it's not a one-way road, it seems, from that chart. The other important thing to note with the second chart that you can see on your right-hand side is that AI adoption also varies a lot by sector. And again, this is for the US, but I'll show you some data on labor later on across the world, which seems to actually confirm that type of picture. There are parts or sectors within the economy that are, for instance, highly data-fied already. Think of information technology, communication, think of finance, where AI adoption seems to be easy, right? These are very susceptible to using AI to optimize parts of their service provision, for example. But there are other sectors, such as agriculture, construction, transportation, and warehousing, even though we think a lot about Amazon when we think about AI uses and automation, which seem to be using AI much less. And that's just important to notice. This type of variation will also vary across the globe because the unobserved variable on this picture is, of course, labor costs, right? So we also detail in the book how in some parts of the world where labor costs for the same kind of economic activity are lower, these sectors in these specific places will also be much less likely to adopt AI. This is just an observation that helps us nuance some of these universal claims to how AI will reform economies across the globe. This is also true for the public sector itself. One of the, at least desired, if we look at EU Commission talk, champions in adopting and rolling out AI in big style. There is a study by the OECD just last year, which compared over 200 different use cases of AI within governments in the OECD world. So take it with a grain of salt. But even within the OECD world, this varies a lot. You can see different functions of government. Some of them are much more likely to include AI trials than others. But the more interesting thing to observe here on the right-hand side is that a lot of the projects where AI is adopted are either in a planning phase, under development, even though I don't quite understand the difference of that, not even from the report. They are pilots, or they are not used at all. So if you look at that graph, around 60 to 80, depending on what you count here, of the projects using AI in the public sector are actually not operational. And that's something to bear in mind. We don't have the similar kind of data for private sector uses of AI, but there are indications and report on them in the book that there is also a high incentive for over-reporting the use of AI. To do with the speculative narratives, consultancy logics, etc., that Daniel alluded to earlier. This suggests that it's very pertinent, also as part of our research in the future, to look more closely what firms, for example, but also governments mean when they say they adopt AI. Does it really change and transform processes at the very heart, or is it very shallow? Is it piloting type of uses? Moving on to the effects of labor, and this is where I try to summarize very briefly findings from our chapter 5. There's a lot of discussion, which all of you will be familiar with in labor economics in particular, but also in conversations with our students nowadays, I guess, about how many and what kind of jobs will be lost to AI, right? Will be automated fully, as in replacing workers. Think of clerks, think of translators nowadays, maybe think of academic paper writers. Which ones might be augmented by using AI? Entry-level programming is much easier these days that ChatGPT can help you provide code, right? And where maybe new jobs will emerge as well. I mean, prompt engineer was not a job description when I finished my political science degree, right? So we revisit this kind of discussion at the beginning of chapter 5 to chart a bit of a baseline for the uneven effects on different types of jobs. And the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report that we draw on here quite a lot from 2025 suggests, for instance, that 55% of the surveyed firms, again in richer economies, were expecting to automate at least parts of the work tasks. And they predicted a loss of roughly 14 million jobs across the world, which would be 2% of current employment. Now, again, it's very important to look more closely of where that will actually happen, because there's a lot of things lumped together in universal statements like that, right? And the World Economic Forum does disaggregate this prediction by job tasks. And this is just a really small snippet from a much longer report. Again, to be looked at with a bit of a grain of salt, because it's mainly from the rich world. But it already gives us an indication that sectors such as financial services and capital markets have much higher automation rates, as it were, compared to medical and healthcare services. Now, we haven't done empirical work into explaining that, but our intuition is that it depends on things like, and I mentioned that before, the availability of high quality data in some of these sectors, the extent to which legacy firms in the sector are already using highly data-fied processes and have access to the data, and to computing power, but also things like how easy is it to automate some of these work tasks, for instance, in the medical field where a lot of personal interaction is still going on. So again, just a reason to look more closely by sector. We don't want to obsess about that, though. So we engage with that debate about where jobs get lost and where they might be augmented. But we think that this whole debate about labor productivity and where jobs can be automated is also misleading for another reason. And that's because it ignores the very heavy, often invisible, often also new kind of labor that goes into producing AI, right? So within the stack production chain, as it were. And that's true for data annotation labor. So you see here a so-called AI sweatshop. We didn't come up with that term. An activist from Kenya did in the Philippines. And they use this term sweatshop very deliberately, as you can imagine, to indicate the analogy and the parallels, structural parallels in labor division across the globe from the textile production, right? Something that was much discussed in the 80s and 90s. But again, you know, and reminding us of what Daniel said earlier about the politics and the role of institutions in that, this new labor division in producing AI is not an automatism to our mind. It's a matter of how well or unwell institutions are prepared to avoid AI firms being able to externalize this cost onto the global south mainly, for example. So if corporate responsibility were enforced across the AI stack, similarly to corporate social responsibility in textile, even though that's a lot of lip service there too, presumably, maybe the AI products we see today, these freemium models, would have to be much more expensive. And then the whole value gain from them would be a little bit smaller for the big firms. At the very least, understanding and factoring in these kind of unequal and exploitative relationships is a starting point for understanding how AI transforms the global political economy from our perspective. I'll spend 5 more minutes to go through our last point, 2 of our last points combined, and that is how the rest of the world, so outside talking about economic sectors and labor, how countries across the world try to position themselves within this highly dominated AI race that the US and China are leading. You've seen a similar graph by Daniel before, and this is about, this time around, about countries who have an AI strategy. This map looked different in 2021. There was hardly any southern, global south country apart from Australia or in India with an AI strategy back then. And it's interesting to us that by now more than 80 countries across the globe, including countries like Lesotho, Malaysia, Tunisia, Uganda, have an AI strategy. So what is this about? I mean, for the EU, and Daniel already hinted to it, the idea is that, you know, this fear of losing out, so FOMO on the promised benefits in wealth, also military power, countries, at least with deep enough pockets, try to enter this race. So large investment rounds, dwarfed in comparison to the US, but still also happen outside the US and China. That's true of the EU, that's true of India, but that's also true of countries in the Gulf who are now trying to build the largest data centers in the world in collaboration with US firms. So we see similar types of movements across the world. For the countries with lower resources that you see in pink perhaps here, AI strategies are mainly about data localization, so trying to stay sovereign in some areas of this AI production, and about data annotation labor law at the moment. So different competitiveness strategies emerge within that race, depending on where countries are in this global value chain. But even within the richer countries, and this is what you see here, you can see that the color, the different partitions of these different colored columns varies across different countries. So some of them focus more on things like capital investments, if they have deep enough pockets. That would be to some extent true of the Gulf states, for example. Others focus more on skills that they have, etc. So it's worth disentangling how countries from South Korea all the way down to Germany, which have more or less a similar AI vibrancy ranking, how this is composed internally, right? And what their respective competitive advantages, if you wish, are in that race. Europe itself is highly uneven. So even looking within somewhere like Europe, you will see that countries such as Norway, Luxembourg, Switzerland, don't think coincidentally the richest countries per capita in Europe are predicted to gain much more in terms of productivity from AI. And the laggards, as it were, Romania and Bulgaria, should also be no surprise to this audience, and we can discuss it more later on. I'll skip over that just to get to our last point, and this is what is the strategy then, or the scope in terms of how AI transforms the economy for these poorer parts of the world. And this is something we discuss in detail in chapter 6. And it's really where this AI from the majority world idea that scholars from the global south have developed takes hold. So techno-optimists seem to hail, and I mean, part of that also comes from big tech itself, that the rollout of AI across the world will basically lift all the boats, right? So bringing Meta's or Facebook's freemium versions into Africa will by itself lead to economic progress. For example, because it allows local self-employed people to market their products across the world quite easily. And part of that is probably true. At the same time, of course, Daniel described earlier these really strong power concentrations in terms of infrastructure, computing infrastructure, and also data that might mean, and a lot of scholars have described that this is just a new form, or reinforced form of imperial dependence, right? We think that that's true in a lot of ways, but we shouldn't forget that there is agency in the global south itself, partly agency that reproduces these forms of interdependence. Think of authoritarian regimes, not just in the global south, by the way, working closely with facial recognition technology firms to control the local opposition. So this is a way where the working with more imperial power is of mutual benefit, perhaps, at least in the short run. And there are also kind of mixed stories by these firms bringing AI products into the global south, where the Chinese phone maker Entrenching, for example, sells its technology that can better recognize Black faces as a decolonial tool, that overcomes racial bias and offers better products for customers in the global south and people of color. At the same time, uses this marketing wedge, as it were, to build the largest data pool of Black faces in the world, which can then be reused in new business cases and for new products. So what we want to hail here, I guess, is a word of caution as to whose interests matter and how they play out in any one place in the world, right? So this coexistence between a global concentration of power with big tech firms, for sure, being reproduced in specific ways depending on where you are in the globe. We also talk, and I don't have time to talk about this here now, because we really want to move to the Q&A. We talk about pockets of resistance in the global south, but also in the global north, to some of these dynamics, and we're very happy to chat about them in the Q&A. So I want to stop with our last slide, a bit of a provocative ending. So ours is a call to see these AI transformations across the globe with a more, we guess, realistic, nuanced, but also ideology critical toolbox that we think global political economy, critical political economy holds. And to our minds, that means not treating AI as a technological phenomenon alone, but also not as an economistic determinism. So considering politics and especially the role of the state is very important to us. But a last message is also that we should insist, therefore, for the role of social scientific knowledge in this game to unpack some of these power dynamics. And that's why we're here, and we're looking forward to discussing this work with you all. Thank you.